So thank you so much for joining, taking the time. It's at this sometimes busy time of the year for academics and educators to join this, what surely will be a very informative webinar. We have ISL interpreters who will provide translation during the webinar, and Kiva has in the chat put some further information about that. Microphones and cameras will be disabled for the duration of the webinar, but we are happy to take questions throughout the webinar through the Q&A tab, which will appear at the top of your screen, hopefully. Just to say, we do have quite a few individuals joining the webinar today, and so it is likely that we will receive quite a volume of questions. I suppose just in the interest of managing that, if you see a question that you think is a question that you would like to learn more about, if you could put a like beside that question, and we can, that will be something that we would seek to prioritize then during the question and answer session. So we are recording today's webinar, and it will be posted on the QQI website in due course. Just to say, though, that we will not record the Q&A component of the webinar. We'll record the element around the talks from the two presenters who are joining us today. If you do have any technical issues, to put those into the chat, and we have some support from QQI today to help you with those technical issues. So just before we get started and introduce the wonderful speakers we have today, just to outline to you, I suppose, the work of the National Academic Integrity Network and our positioning within the academic integrity setting. So this is a peer collaborative network. It was established by QQI in 2019, and it has representatives from quite a few areas of the education sector, so including learners such as those from student unions. We have representatives from education providers, institutions, agencies and organisations, anyone with an interest in further and higher education and training and academic integrity. So hopefully you'll have seen some of the good work from the network to date, and if indeed you are interested in learning more about the network, please do access information through the QQI website on the National Academic Integrity Network. So without further ado then, I'm going to start with the introduction of the speakers. So we're delighted today to be joined by two speakers, Professor Philip Newton and Professor Michael Draper. Professor Philip Newton is Professor of Medical Science Education at Swansea University in the UK, where he teaches neuroscience. He also teaches the principles of evidence-based education on programmes in medical education. Phil's research is on teaching and assessment, and he is a policy consultant on higher education for the Council of Europe. And Professor Michael Draper is Professor in Legal Education and Institutional Lead for Academic Integrity at Swansea University. He's a member of 2 National Law Society committees. He's also a consultant expert with the UK Quality Assurance Agency and the Council of Europe ETNED platform, who has regular meetings in Strasbourg and throughout Europe. Michael is a Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy and a member of the Professional Development Committee of the UK Advising and Tutoring Association. He's co-chair of the Welsh Academic Integrity and Assessment Network. So 2 wonderful experts in the field of academic integrity, and we're delighted to have them here today. So firstly, I'm going to hand over to Professor Newton, who will initially present his aspect of the presentation, and then Professor Draper will take over from that. So Professor Newton, when you're ready, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mary Claire, and thank you very much also to QQI for the invitation. It's always good to work with you folks, and I think in Ireland you're very lucky to have QQI taking a leadership role for the global sector on some of these challenges and opportunities with generative AI. As you will know, what we're going to talk about today is ensuring valid, reliable, and inclusive assessment in the generative era with myself and Michael. And the framing of the question is the title is very much as a question. We're really going to try and make sure that we have some level of discussion around this topic because I have a lot of thoughts about this as well. I'm sure many of you do, but I don't think any one of us has all of the answers at this stage. This is a rapidly evolving, complicated topic, and we're only really going to get to an answer to this question by working together on it. So if you, as Mary Claire said, if you have any comments, observations, particularly relating to this question, how do we ensure valid, reliable and inclusive assessment, pop them in the chat and I will try, sorry, not pop them in the chat, pop them in the Q&A, and I will try and deal with them as we go along, or we'll save them to the end with a longer discussion in that section there. So I'm going to situate the context of what's going to come by talking about, just briefly reflecting on, I guess, why we care about assessment. It seems obvious, but I think in this sort of discussion with this major challenge, it needs just a brief reminder to us all about why this is an important topic. Because it is in many ways the defining feature of what we do in further and higher education. We do lots of things as colleges and as universities. We teach, we do research, we're a social hub. But the thing that defines what it is that we're able to do, and the legal definition of tertiary education providers in many ways, is the award of a qualification. So we issue a certificate to our graduates, and that is a statement of what they are able to do at that particular time to whichever standard it is that we're measuring them against. And that's also really what society is asking from us. They want to know, what can our graduates actually do? And then society asks our graduates to go on to take important roles, nurses, midwives, doctors, lawyers, engineers, philosophers, historians, etc., graduating from our tertiary education providers with a certification of their learning, and that certification comes from our assessments. So it's really important that our assessments are a valid, fair, reliable and accurate measure of what it is that someone can do. There have been very many challenges with this issue over the years, but I think all of the challenges paled into insignificance just over 3 years ago, November the 30th, 2022, and that was the day that ChatGPT was launched into the world. And those of us involved in assessment, in particular in academic integrity, assessment security, have been scrambling ever since to try and figure out what it is that we're going to do about and with the issues, the opportunities and the threats that these tools pose. We're now in a situation where there are at least 4, maybe 5 major ChatGPT-like tools. ChatGPT being the original and still the major market leader. Google has Gemini, Microsoft have Copilot. There's also Claude, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. And then the Chinese state company DeepSeek has their own version of these tools. And these tools are generative AI tools. Now, it's always challenging when doing these situations because there are going to be people in the webinar who use these tools every day, and I'm one of those, and we probably know quite a lot about what these tools are and how they work. There will be people who never use these tools or have used them only a handful of times and have heard a lot about them. And the difference between our understanding of what they are and what they do is going to be quite broad. So to accommodate that, we're going to proceed on the basis that folks here don't know an awful lot about what these tools are and how they work, and we're going to sprinkle a little bit in about that as we go through the evidence about what these tools can and can't do with assessment. I should also have said, and Marie Claire did say, I guess I'm a neuroscientist. I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not an artificial intelligence expert. I spend a lot of time teaching education, so I know a lot about how carbon-based intelligence works, but I'm not a computer scientist. I'm just a nerd for assessment, and it's very clear that these tools have an impact on assessment. What I'll do is I'll just summarize what it is that I'm going to present. Right, so I'll tell you what I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to tell you, and then we'll summarize it again at the end. So I think my role here is really just to talk about the evidence base for the impact of these tools on assessment. I have my own thoughts about what we could and should do about this, but I think we'll really try and focus on the what to do part in the questions and especially at the end in the Q&A. So I'm really just going to try and set the scene for that discussion with a consideration of some of the research that we and other people have done. And I'm going to summarize that at the beginning by giving you 3 basic points that I think capture the main messages. And the first of those points is that generative AI tools, the ones I just showed you, they are really, really good at many types of assessment. And in particular, the assessment types that they're really good at are written coursework, so things like essays, dissertations, projects, that sort of thing, and exams that are based upon multiple choice type formats, the sorts that we use all throughout higher education, in particular in regulated professions like medicine, law, and so on. When a student uses these tools for their assessment, it is largely undetectable. Right? Now, there's obviously some nuance to this, and we will go back over that in a few slides' time. But essentially, the output of these tools is very difficult to detect, other than if one is standing over the shoulder of a student while they do the assessment. The actual written work produced by these tools, the answers to the exam questions, are very difficult to detect, although there is a question mark there for obvious reasons that we'll come on to. The second point then is that despite what I've just told you, it seems that tertiary education providers, further and higher education all over the world, particularly in the UK, Ireland, Australia, and the US, we are still using these assessment types. As we'll see, almost every student is still assessed using some sort of written coursework, and that is an asynchronous and unsupervised form of assessment. The same, remarkably, is true with exams. One of the things that got us into doing this webinar is myself and Michael did some work last year where the punchline of which is that every university in the UK, more or less, is still using these COVID-era exams. So an exam that is by name an exam, the students are told to do it under exam conditions, but they do it at home, online, unsupervised, with no real way of making sure that exam conditions are followed. And then those are fertile grounds for the use of AI, which brings us then to the third point, which brings those two things together. AI is really good at these assessments. Universities and colleges are still using these assessments, and so unsurprisingly, students are using AI tools to complete their assessments. And that's really where I'm going to start with some of the data. I'm just going to show you a graph, because the graph is one of my favorite things. And it, I think, illustrates the level of change that there has been in the use of these tools over the years, and also helps us understand a bit more about the context in which we're going to have this discussion. So the graph is very simple. The graph shows along the x-axis the number of months since the launch of ChatGPT back in November 2022. And on the y-axis, which shows the percentage of university students, and this is only in higher education, these results, as most of them will be, because that's my domain, the percentage of university students who say that they are using AI tools in their assessments. So there have been dozens, over 100 now, survey type studies that have asked students in multiple disciplines all over the world some version of a question: are you using AI in your assessments? And the graph simply shows the percentage of students who say yes. And if we plot that then against the months, against time, and the months since the launch of ChatGPT, you can see a very stark, very strong picture. This project isn't finished, but I think the results here are not really going to change. And if you look in the top right-hand corner of that graph, you will see the main punchline, which is that right now, it's a January assessment period for lots of us. Students are using AI in their assessments, and the vast majority of them are doing that. This situation then tells us a little bit more about the context in which, like I said, we're going to have a discussion. The first point I want to make about this is I am a card-carrying pragmatist, and there are lots of us who do or don't like AI, who don't want students to be using AI, or do want students to be using AI. Regardless of whether we like it or we don't, it's happening. Students are using these tools in their assessments. The fact that they are using these tools in their assessments does not mean that they are cheating. And although this webinar is under the guise of the Academic Integrity Network, I think it's important to be clear, this is not really about cheating. This is a step back from cheating. This is about making sure that assessments are valid and reliable and fair and inclusive and so on. Academic integrity and the flip side to that, cheating, are a really important part of that. But just because a student uses AI in an assessment doesn't mean that they are cheating. In some cases, they are allowed to use AI in their assessments. The vast majority of cases here, they are not. But it doesn't mean that they're breaking the rules, in part because we don't really yet know what those rules are. And we'll come back to that as well a bit later on. It's also helpful, I think, to consider how it is that we have ended up in a situation where the numbers of students who are using this new technology in their assessments is almost all of them. And that is because the tools are currently available for free. They're available in our phones, and you can pay a little bit more as a student if you want better access to the tools or access to a better version of the tool. But the honest truth is that the power needed to be able to work with these tools on the assignments that we currently set students is normally available in the free versions of the apps. And it is unregulated. So the companies that make these tools are largely based in the United States. The current administration of the United States has made it very clear that they are not going to regulate these tools or the companies that make them. In fact, quite the opposite. They're embedding these tools into American society, American government administration and higher education. And that will have a knock-on effect all over the world because they are available for free wherever you are in the world. And the companies themselves are in this technological arms race to try and gain maximum market share or maximum impact, etc. And so that means that the rapid pace of change and improvement in these tools is not going to change anytime soon. Our learners, be they college, university students, they're adults, and so they are independent. They are accessing these tools independently. Essentially, there is nothing we can do about it. As educators, it is very difficult for us to justify a position where we say to students, you cannot use ChatGPT or Gemini in any way because we have no control over their ability to do that. And it is available, like I said, for free at the touch of a button. And the final point, I guess, is that these companies that make the tools, they very much want to be seen as part of the future of education at all levels, including us in tertiary education. They're embedding themselves in our learning management systems. They're making their own education systems. They're making their own versions of their tools that work specifically for education. So this situation isn't going to change anytime soon. Okay. So let's go to the main bulk of what certainly I'm going to talk about, which is what these tools can do with the types of assessments that we use in tertiary education. Since ChatGPT came out, many of us have been engaged in essentially running these tools through a generative AI Olympics. We've been putting these tools through their paces, getting them to do all sorts of different types of assessments, just seeing how well they do. These tools are dressed as doctors because I work in a medical school, and so medical education is where our focus has been. But the results I'm going to show you really are applicable to more or less any type of assessment. Excuse me. And I'm going to start our consideration of the evidence on this by just showing you one of the latest things that we found. And although it's one of the latest things that we found, it's already going out of date because it's from this summer. Now, this isn't directly related to assessment. This is a video that can be made using any one of the tools now. This one was made using Google's VO3. And I'm showing you this video not because it's directly related to assessment, but because it actually contains within it the main punchlines of what these tools can do with our assessments. All right, so this is a really short video made by one of our students, Flora, and she was trying to look at the potential for these tools to be used in medical education, specifically about neuroradiology, which in plain language is going to get a brain scan. And she asked VO3 to make her a video of a patient going to a clinic to get a brain scan. And what this tells us, it tells us many things. One of the things it tells us is that the way that these text-based, LLM-based AI tools work now is that they can talk to other AI tools. So this is essentially the large language model technology of Google Gemini talking to the video generation technology of VO3. So you, as a user, have one interface where you simply use plain language and you ask it to make you a video. And she's asked it to make her a video of a patient going to a clinic to get a brain scan. The video is 8 seconds long. You don't have to know anything about medicine or brain scans, I think, to get the two main things that I want you to take from this video. One of which is the astonishing quality of the video, how absolutely lifelike it is, even though it is entirely artificial. And then there is, at the end of the 8 seconds, a catastrophic failure within the video that I think all of us will be able to capture. All right, I've given her a big build up. Let's press play. If you can't hear it, please do pop that in the Q&A, and then I'll be able just to find that.
Hello, I have an appointment for an MRI scan.
Of course, let me just check you in.
All right, so I realize I'm looking at the Q&A rather than the chat. Okay. Wait a second. Let me just make sure I'm looking at the Q&A. Where is it gone? There it is. Okay. All right. So there you've got the video. Astonishing quality. It looks like every hospital that our medical students go to, and then probably you've been in. The sound of her shoes sounds a lot like exactly what we would expect shoes to sound like. She is clearly a patient. She's of an age and a demographic that might be going for a brain scan, and yet you can see when she goes to the desk, the roles are reversed, and the healthcare provider is the one who gives the language of going for the brain scan, and then the patient is the one who tries to check it in. So it's a catastrophic failure, which completely undermines the educational value of this video for Flora's purposes, but also shows in 8 seconds what these tools are all about. Astonishing power in many realms, but occasional catastrophic failure that undermines many of the things that they can do. And that, I think, is a situation that's new to us. It's not the sort of thing we would expect from a human educator or many of the technologies that we're used to working with, and yet summarizes, I think, where we are. All right, so let's go back to the data then. So, all right, I realize now why I keep losing the Q&As, because it's on the wrong page. There we go. All right, so I'm going to now spend a little bit of time going back to the very beginning. These are the first bits of research that we did, and it wasn't actually primary research that we did. It was, okay, there's a comment to say that the video didn't play very well in the PowerPoint, it was jumpy. Okay, I think I've explained what the video is all about, and I'll be completely honest with you, the folks who are here, it's also a well-established instructional design tool that after talking about some heavy and difficult stuff for about 15 minutes, you should lighten the mood ever so slightly. So if you didn't actually capture the video, just note that I have attempted to lighten the mood, and now we're going to get back to some of the more challenging stuff. So early on, there were lots and lots and lots of people who did some version of a research study that was feeding exam questions into ChatGPT and then attempting to see how well ChatGPT did with those exam questions. So they would take an exam, whether they were a medic or a lawyer or an engineer or whatever, they'd feed it into ChatGPT, how many did it get right, and how did that compare to human test takers? And there were so many of these in July of 2023 that myself and Myra were able to write a review about how well ChatGPT did on these studies. I'm showing you this even though it's really out of date, because it also allows me to explain very briefly a little bit more about what ChatGPT is for those of you who aren't familiar, and to clarify some of the terminology. ChatGPT is a chatbot, and it is powered by a large language model. So if you hear LLM frequently, that's what LLM stands for, is large language model, and the LLM is the AI. All right, ChatGPT itself is not an AI. It's powered by an AI, and it's essentially a technical infrastructure that's built around the large language model. The simplest way that I have had it explained to me is that if you think about the LLM as an engine and ChatGPT as being a car that is built around the engine, you can obviously build many different types of vehicle around the same engine. That also explains a little bit about why the performance of Microsoft's Copilot is different to that of ChatGPT, even though they are built around the same LLM, which is a GPT. Excuse me. The LLMs themselves are frequently updated. So just like Windows 10 was updated to Windows 11, and Windows 10 came from 98, 3.1, whatever it is, the LLMs, the AIs are updated. But even within that, then the different LLMs are the same versions of those are updated themselves as well. So if you're used to logging into a public sector computer, it will update almost every time that you do it. Windows 11 itself hasn't actually changed, but the version of Windows 11 itself has changed, and there have been various changes to it. The same thing happens every time you open ChatGPT. You're logging into a slightly different version of the tool than you were the last time that you used it. Let's go back then to this review that Maya and I wrote. This was about the performance of ChatGPT on various exams across higher education. I'm only going to show you the exams from medicine. There's a lot of them because for reasons that are for a discussion for another day. We love giving people exams. We have to take exams to get into medical school. You have to take exams to get out of medical school. And then you have to take exams all the way through postgraduate training. Now, when ChatGPT was launched, it was powered by an LLM called GPT-3, and the GPT-3 LLM was updated quite quickly to GPT 3.5. And these two LLMs, they were really the first ChatGPT, the first publicly available version of these tools, and they were able to get into medical school, and they were able to pass the exams. They were able to get out of medical school. They could pass medical licensing exams. But most of the exams that people have to take during postgraduate medicine, they failed. And this makes sense. And it also allows me to illustrate another point, that these are not MCQ exam questions that are simple fact recall. They're not asking what is the capital of Spain, for example. They are complex problem-solving clinical vignettes that require the test taker to pick an action, and they're really difficult. And ChatGPT found the hardest of those really hard. Now, on March the 14th, 2023, ChatGPT was updated. So GPT-3 and 3.5 were put on a shelf. GPT-4 was launched, and GPT-4 could pass everything. And there was not an exam that it was given that it could not pass. And I want to highlight there in the middle of the slide, you can see, let me just change my pointer. Neurosurgery, we have a saying in the English language that if a subject is academically easy, we would say it's not brain surgery. The implication being that brain surgery is really hard, because it is really hard. And yet here is ChatGPT passing the applied knowledge questions that brain surgeons have to take in order to become brain surgeons. So these are hard questions to answer. Okay. We did a version of this. Why is my pointers has to be changed back? We did a version of one of these studies then a little bit later. So this now is in May of 2024. We fed ChatGPT the Medical Schools Council licensing exam. So essentially the exam that doctors in the UK have to take to join the medical register. And there are practice versions of this exam on the Medical Schools Council website that had already been fed to GPT-4, and GPT-4 had scored 76%. Now in May 2024, ChatGPT was updated again. GPT-4 was parked. GPT-4o was rolled out. We fed GPT-4o this exam, and it got 94%. All right, so we've gone on this huge jump from GPT 3.5, which gets about half the exam questions right, GPT-4o, which is now itself an obsolete ChatGPT that gets almost all the questions right. That's not actually why we did this study. We did this study because there was a piece of feedback that we would get when we presented results like this that hinted at a misunderstanding about how these tools work. And that's why I'm showing it to you, to clarify a little bit about what these tools do. These generative AI tools generate new content based upon their training. They don't search their training materials and then copy and paste from content that they have seen before. They're not a sort of glorified Google. They are very different to that, and in many ways much more sophisticated. But there were people who thought that these tools were essentially a glorified Google, and that led them to the conclusion that the reason why they thought ChatGPT would answer so many of these exam questions right was because the exams were in the public domain. Right? So this exam paper was on the website of the Medical Schools Council. Everything that's on the internet had formed part of the training materials for GPT-4 and 4.0 and everything since. And so the argument went, that's why ChatGPT answers all these exam questions, because it's seen them before. So we wanted to test this, and we tested this by taking that exam paper and rewriting every single question in it 3 times. So if there was an exam question in the public exam paper that was about 56-year-old Mr. Smith from Cork, then we would change it to be about 58-year-old Mrs. Jones from Swansea. Okay, the underlying learning outcome would be the same, but all of the language that was used in the question, we changed it so that it was completely new and it had never existed until we typed it into ChatGPT. And when we did that, ChatGPT 4.0 got 94%. So it's able to answer novel questions. It's solving these problems. Whether it's doing it using the same cognitive processes as a human is a discussion for another day, but it is clearly not copying and pasting from its training materials. Since the launch of ChatGPT, we've had more versions of GPT than I can count. This is one of the slides that I had to update last night because we are now up to GPT 5.2. Each version, each update of the GPT has had slightly different strengths. Many of them are now obsolete. And we are at the point now where GPT 5.2 is the default, and it is many orders of magnitude better than the original GPT 3 and 3.5 on many of the benchmarks that it's tested against. Okay, let me just check in with the Q&A. There's nothing in there. All right. Okay. So you would need to have totally different problems, not just renaming variables and problems like names. Yes, it is a good point. In the paper, we do get deep into the pragmatic detail of that. But it is an important question, I guess. It's an important point for the discussion we're having today. Essentially, for most topics, there are subjects that have to be assessed. So medicine is obviously the thing that I'm the most familiar with. And when assessing medicine, students have to learn basic anatomy. They have to learn about Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, chest pain, etc. And they have to learn certain things about those. And there are only so many ways that you can assess them. So even if it was the case that ChatGPT was leaning on its training materials or recognizing common patterns in exam questions in order to be able to answer them, that doesn't really change the fact that ChatGPT is able to answer those exam questions in ways that undermine our ability to use these sorts of exam questions in a summative assessment without controlling their access to ChatGPT. That's a good point. Thank you. Okay, let's switch gears ever so slightly. We're going to talk now about generative AI and written work. This is probably the thing that people had the most concern about when ChatGPT was first launched. It is a text generating tool after all, and there has been a lot of work about this, and I'm really just going to summarize it because I think the punchline, the conclusion of all of the research that's been done on this is pretty clear, and that is that ChatGPT is able really to write better essays than human authors. Now, I'm going to caveat what I'm saying there because I know it's a fairly bold statement to make. In the references that I've given you there, all of which are at least a year or 18 months old, those are all studies that have done some version of a blinded experiment. Okay, so they have asked ChatGPT to write an essay or a project or an exam long answer, whatever it might be. And then they've taken the answers provided by ChatGPT, they've put them in amongst some answers written by human test takers, and they've given them to markers and asked them to mark them and not told them which ones are which. And when you do that in a blinded experiment, ChatGPT scores equivalent or better than the human test takers. When markers are asked, could you tell us which ones were ChatGPT or not? At the time, in those studies, markers could not tell the difference. Now, this is something where I think there's an opportunity for more research, really, because I think this is evolving. There's a small amount of research to show that actually people who use ChatGPT a lot, they can kind of tell. And certainly, anecdotally, as a person who uses ChatGPT a lot and marks a lot of student assignments, I know the language, the cadence, the Syncopation that's used by ChatGPT uses a lot of words without saying an awful lot, for example. Whether that's any use to me in designing assessments, I don't know. That's something we can talk about a bit later on. But the blinded studies claim that most markers can't tell the difference. The better the tool, or the more recent the tool, the better the work. So GPT-3 wasn't as good as 4, wasn't as good as 5. There are a lot of companies that talk about text detectors, and their use is problematic. I'm going to come back to that and talk a little bit more detail about that in a few minutes' time. There was a strong observation early on in the life of ChatGPT that when you got it to do a bit of academic writing, it would hallucinate references. Now, hallucination is maybe a term that I should have explained at the beginning. It's painful for me as a neuroscientist that the computer scientists have stolen the term hallucination from us, but they have. And essentially what hallucinate means in the context of generative AI is making things up that don't exist, which is what hallucination is. And as ChatGPT got better and better at academic writing, it would get better and better at not making up the content, but it would still make up the references. It's much better at doing that now, and I've put better in inverted commas because I'm not sure that's actually what we want. But if you say to ChatGPT, can you write me a 2,000-word assignment on, I don't know, the history of Swansea City Football Club, and reference it using APA 7, it will do that, and the content will be almost all accurate, but the references might still be problematic. They will look like references, but some of them might not exist. I want to talk about a very specific type of written assignment, which is an angle that many of us took early on about what we might do to try and preserve the validity of written assignments in the face of generative AI, and that is to personalize them. And in medical education, we use a very specific type of personalized assessment that is reflective writing. Essentially, where in the case of medicine, a medical student or a trainee will encounter a patient, often a challenging, difficult situation for them, and they will be asked to use one of the many reflective models that there are to write a reflective account of it. And that is obviously then very personal, very specific, and is used in many other domains as well outside of medicine, and was something that we all thought maybe might be something we could lean on as a way of keeping asynchronous written assessments within our particular discipline. Now, one of our students, on our medical education program, the amazing Emma Furzer, she is a GP trainee, a primary care trainee, and primary care trainees in the UK and all over the world have to do a lot of reflective writing. And she was very concerned last summer about whether people were using AI to help them with their reflective writing. So she wrote a review that essentially attempted to answer this question: is reflective writing a valid summative assessment in the age of generative AI, which is very much similar to the question we're asking more generally here. And I'm going to show you a bit of the detail of what she found, because I think it helps us understand some of the nuance of the discussion that we're trying to have. I'll tell you the punchline that she came to, which was no, it isn't. And then I'll tell you a little bit about why that is. And that is because you can say to ChatGPT, can you write me a reflective account of 56-year-old Mr. Smith from Cork who presented with A, B, C, D, and E, and it will do it. And if you take that same blinded approach, nobody can really tell that the text was written by ChatGPT, and the marks that it is given will be equivalent to or better than humans. I should also have said I keep using the term ChatGPT to mean all generative AI. I do that because most of the research has been done with ChatGPT, and it's also the one that I have in my phone. So I'm really talking about all generative AI now because their performance is more or less the same. Part of me telling you this is also to make a point that one of the things you can do with these tools now is upload content to them. So if you have patient notes or a PDF of something, you can upload it to ChatGPT and it will read it and base its response upon it. We desperately don't want people to be uploading patient notes or confidential content to these tools, but there is nothing to stop them doing that is built into the tools themselves. And so that presents a tangential but significant risk for us in terms of assessment. In amongst the studies that Emma was reviewing, she also found something which I think is astonishing and existentially difficult, where ChatGPT was asked to write reflective accounts of patient encounters, either real or fictitious. And the reflective accounts were then given to qualitative researchers, and the qualitative researchers were asked to analyze the content of the reflective writing, and in particular, to evaluate how authentic the writing was, i.e. how human it was, and the emotional content of it, and in particular, how much positive affect it had. And the punchline of that was that ChatGPT's output was rated as more human than the output written by the humans and contained more positive affect. And what that means is a philosophy discussion for another day, but I think it does tell us a lot about the potential for using these this format of an assessment. The content that you're going to get from AI is going to be really good. There is some literature suggesting that you could use generative AI as a partner in these types of written assessments, and some people would rather talk to these tools than talk to other humans. And so the where we've got to with this, which maybe might help us with some of the other discussions we're going to have about other assessment formats, is essentially the proposal was from this research: look, let students use the AI in however way they want, as long as they respect confidentiality, privacy, etc. And then if we're going to assess them, they come and talk to us, and we do that assessment in person. And if they reflected using AI or they reflected using old-fashioned pen and paper, it doesn't matter. Whatever is best for them, the assessment is an in-person discussion or an in-person presentation. And that seems to be the way forward for professional bodies in medicine, at least, who want to try and preserve the value of reflective practice. All right, let me just check back in on the Q&A. That seems to be okay. And we've got some content in the chat. All right. All right, so let's go on then to this question of AI text detectors. I told you that it's undetectable. I've put a question mark in there for good reason. Essentially, there are many companies that promise AI text detection. Essentially, what that proposes is companies like Turnitin have a function within them that will give you a prediction of how likely it is that text was written by AI, what proportion of the text meets that prediction, and some other nuance and detail broken down in the sort of way that you can see in the screen here. And there are many, many versions of these tools. Now, there is a lot of often very heated discussion about these tools, about whether they work, about whether we should use them, and what the implications are from us using them. Now, I don't propose to get into the detail of that discussion, in part because it would take an hour in and of itself. I'm just going to make a couple of summary points and then give you a little bit of detail on a third point. The first point is that these tools are actually accurate. Right? They're pretty accurate on unedited output from some of the older versions of these tools. All right. The challenge is they're not 100% accurate. So you always get some level of false positive, which is the second point, really. And for many of us, I think that risk is unacceptably high. Even if it is very low, if you use these tools, there is no other way that you can independently verify that the tools are correct. Unlike with traditional originality detection, if this tool says there is a 99% chance that this was written by AI, and the student says, no, I didn't, then there's nothing you can do. Whereas if it says there's a 99% chance this is copied from Wikipedia, well, then you open Wikipedia and you compare the two, and it's very clear. That's the second point. The detailed point I want to make is that even if the tools are accurate on unedited output from some of the older versions, there are easy ways around this. And if you were to go to YouTube, you would find thousands of videos with titles and thumbnails like this that give students step-by-step advice about how to get around these AI text detection tools. Myself and a good colleague, Thomas Foltoniek, we've watched them all so that you don't have to. And in summary, these videos, the 100 or so that we watched, give the same advice over and over again. And that advice is they tell the would-be assignment writers, look, use the best AI tool that you can, run it through Copy Zero, ChatGPT Zero, CopyLeaks, etc. Get a sense of how likely it is to be flagged as using AI. If that tool says that it's likely to be AI, then you just do the following. You put it through a different paraphrasing tool, and Quillbot is commonly recommended, essentially to humanize the text, or you can do it by hand. You just make it sound a bit more human, and the most common recommendations for that are put in some spelling mistakes and make it sound like you're writing in a second language. You can maybe write a little bit yourself. That will undermine the performance of these detection tools. And you can actually get the AI to do all of this and then put your assignment back through a text detection tool. So essentially, you say to ChatGPT, can you please write me an essay on whatever topic it is? Make it sound like I'm writing in a language that's not my own, put in some spelling mistakes, make it a little bit humanized, and off it goes. And when you do those things, some work from Mike Perkins and friends in Vietnam showed very clearly that these things work. And when I say they work, they undermine the performance of the text detection tools. And so what that says to me is there's no real pragmatic use to using these tools if we want to make sure that we have valid, reliable, inclusive, and authentic assessments. Okay. The final summary point then is briefly just to talk about the fact that as tertiary education providers, we are using these assessment formats in an unsupervised and asynchronous way. Let me just flip back to the chat, to the Q&A. Yeah, okay. Let's go back to, all right. All right, so this is really where the invitation comes to present at the webinar. I did 2 studies last year, one of them with Michael, who's going to come after me in a few minutes. The first of those studies, what we did is we wrote to every university in the UK using the Freedom of Information Act, and we asked them, are you using summative online unsupervised remote exams? And if you're following along, the acronym for that is SOUR, because at the time I was bitter about the perception that universities seemed, according to anecdotal evidence, to be using these COVID era exams very frequently for high stakes summative decision making. And it turns out that more than 3/4 of UK universities are still using online unsupervised remote exams. So the students are told this is an exam, but you do it at home on your own, and nobody's going to monitor that process. I also ran a survey study of about 1,500 undergraduate students and asked them, are you being assessed using essays? And more than 90% of them were. And I asked them, were they being assessed using these unsupervised online exams? And more than half of them were. Okay, so it shows very clearly that these assessment methodologies are still being used. What we also did when we wrote to the universities in the UK is we said, could you give us your policy that is designed to secure the validity, reliability, and integrity of unsupervised online exams when you're using them for summative assessment? And the universities provided those to us, and we read them all and just looked to see, is AI even in there? And only about 1/4 of those policies had AI in them. So it's not even part of the policy. So if a student opens up the exam and thinks, well, I want to follow the policy, and they open the policy, it's not there. AI is not there. And yet when I asked the students in a survey, do you know what the rules are? Specifically, rate your agreement with the statement, I know what the rules are, etc. Then 85% of them said that they did. So the students tell us that they know what the rules are, even though there aren't any rules at the time about using AI, particularly in these exams. I also asked students whether they had cheated using ChatGPT. I did it this way because what we normally do in academic integrity research is we give students a scenario. A student copies and pastes this from that and does these particular things. Is this cheating, or have you done something similar, as a way of asking whether or not students have cheated? I tried to do that with AI and I realized I couldn't come up with a scenario that I was confident was cheating or not. So instead I just said to the students, have you cheated? And if they said yes, I asked them what they had done. What I found was between 10 and 20% of students said they had cheated, and the same thing was found in a couple of other studies around the world, which is not as many as we might have expected. What was perhaps more informative, though, was what the students said that they had done. So I said to them, if you said that you had cheated, tell me what you did. And then I did a basic thematic analysis of the things that they told me. Now, lots of students answered this question, including students who said that they hadn't cheated, but they told me what they had done anyway. But most of those responses that I analysed were from students who had said that they had cheated, and they said the following. What I did is I got it to do my online exams for me, was very common, or I got it to write my essays for me. Those things I think are clearly cheating. A lot of students told me that they had got AI to explain concepts to them. And I had asked them if they had cheated, what had they done? And they said, I got it to explain the Krebs cycle to me. And that clearly is not cheating. And then there were these things in the middle where students said, well, I wrote an assignment, but I wasn't quite sure if it was good enough, or I wanted to tidy it up, or I'm not writing in my first language, so I got it to proofread it and correct some grammar. Or some people said, like, I got it just to write a first draft or a plan or a structure or an outline. And in those cases, I think I don't really know that they are cheating, and I don't think any of us do, in part because what we're trying to do here is take an old-fashioned type of assessment and fit existing regulations on top of it, and they don't seem to work. We just don't know what it means to cheat or not, and we have to get that right, because if we don't, and we just say to students, don't use AI, they're going to. If we put them in an exam, then we're maybe not using the most valid form of assessment. If we stick with what we've got, then they don't know what they're doing, and nor do we. And that, I think, leads me to my final point. We found, as was in the introduction to the webinar, that students are being asked to do exams online. And lots of students are being asked to do that. They're being asked to do those exams online, but unsupervised. They do them at home in their pajamas, or they're being asked to write an essay, and they're often being told, you don't use AI, or you can only use AI for these things. Right? And this is the sort of regulation that we found when we asked universities to tell us what the regulations were. Then the regulations would say something like this: while this exam takes place in an uncontrolled environment, you must do it completely independently. You mustn't talk to anyone. You mustn't talk to your parents, sibling, partner, friend, or anyone else, or you will be committing an academic offence. So that's, I'm not going to tell you where that's from, but that's a very common regulation that we use in these online exams, that we also use in essays. You must not do these things, but we have no real way of verifying whether or not you have done them. And essentially, I think what that does is it puts a student in a situation that is unfair. It's not fair for us to do it to them. It is a tale that is as old as humanity. The very first story that was written in various versions of The Origin of Humanity talks about, in the case of Christianity, Adam and Eve being put in a situation where there is an enormous temptation placed in front of them, and they are told, here is an enormous temptation. You must not succumb to this temptation. And then, lo and behold, they succumb to the temptation, and now we all have to wear underwear. The point being, we cannot put people in a situation where we tell them you cannot use AI, but we're not going to stop you doing it, and we have no way of detecting that you're going to do it, and they know that AI is going to really do a really good job on their assignment, because we're essentially setting them up to be in a position where they are faced with an unresistible temptation, and they are going to do it. And that takes us all the way back to the beginning, that our assessments are going to be invalid as a result. I can see a comment from John. That's a really good point. I'm going to come back to that in a second, John. Let me just go summarize the summary then. AI is really good at many types of assessment, in particular coursework and exams. We can't really detect it. Nevertheless, in colleges, further and higher education, we're using these types of assessment in an unsupervised asynchronous way. And what that means then is students are going to use them. And we really do need to do something about that, unless we risk undermining the fundamental purpose of the assessment, and thus our fundamental purposes. That leads us then to the question about what we should do about it.
Thank you very much, Phil, and good afternoon. Is it good afternoon? Yes, just about good afternoon, everybody. Great to be here. Just a quick nod to Phil for that very impressive presentation, but also the description of us being carbon-based intelligences. I've not heard that before, so I very much appreciated that. I'm going to start off, I think, by saying a bit of a provocation. One of the things I commonly hear from students is that we need to be trained to use generative AI because it's the future. We're going to be required to use it in employment. To a certain extent, that's true, but I think Phil has demonstrated that the speed of development around generative artificial intelligence and perhaps in the future, artificial intelligence itself is rapid. And some of you may have been aware from reading the media and other reports that the use of generative AI in employment brings its own problems. And those problems are around largely reputation, which takes many, many years to build up and can be lost in an instant. And you probably saw a reference some 6 months ago now, maybe a bit shorter, to a very well-known global accountancy law firm who had produced a report for the Australian government, and an Australian academic had identified the fact that because of certain factors in the report, it had clearly been developed in part by using generative AI. Now, that of course led to the accountancy firm having to pay back part of its fee, and I would suggest we'll probably never get repeat business from that source again. Clear loss of reputation. And certainly in my field of the law, I sit as a part-time judge, we're seeing increasingly litigants in person, as well as qualified lawyers using generative AI to develop arguments and submissions, which do contain fabrications or hallucinations, as Phil referred to. And of course, not only is that a reputational risk, it's also a risk around credibility and integrity, which can be referred then to a regulator. So there are clear issues in practice and employment around the use of generative AI, which can have far more serious consequences. So that comes back to the point about what we're doing in institutions to help develop students for employment. That's one issue. Another issue, I think, relates to what Phil alluded to, and also I've had conversations with colleagues in the Council of Europe when generative AI surfaced. And I was laughed at. As Phil said, this is a British problem or perceived to be a US problem or an Irish problem. Because in Italy, I was told, all of their assessments are oral. They're all vivas in relation to a law degree. And so this wasn't a problem, so far as they could see. Now, of course, things have moved on somewhat, because unless the oral assessment is literally face-to-face with an individual in the same room, software using generative AI, if you happen to have an oral assessment not in the same room, i.e. through the interface of a computer system or other systems such as we're using here, whether that be WhatsApp web or what have you, you can have software which can take a question asked orally by an assessor and immediately provide an answer on screen to the person being assessed, who then repeats that back with a few added nuances as part of the assessment, and will pass the assessment. So oral assessment is actually very useful, provided it's face-to-face in the same room. And the other issue that I have around oral assessment is that it is an assessment which is used quite regularly by myself and other colleagues in the law school, is that often we combine that with a written form of assessment by which the student has to go and write up basically the oral element that they've actually performed. And of course, again, we have no control over that. One of the ways we attempt to address that is that the credit given for the oral part exceeds that given to the written part, so that they cannot pass the assessment unless they've actually passed the oral part. The written part is a subsidiary to the overall mark. So we guarantee credibility in relation to the credit we give that way. Now, a further issue relates to alternative assessments. Now, we're going through curriculum review here at the university at the moment. And as part of that curriculum review, every single module leader has been asked to actually specify on their module pro forma the actual form of alternative assessment, which might be offered to students with reasonable adjustments. For example, Now, the reason why we're doing that, well, it's good practice, but I suppose we were forced to do it a couple of years ago by a decision in the UK relating to Aberhart and Bristol University, which you may have come across, which was based on the Equality Act here in the UK relating to reasonable adjustments. And that particular case did actually involve an oral assessment. So the oral assessment was the primary means of assessment in relation to a module on a science degree. And the student concerned suffered from anxiety, didn't want to undertake the oral assessment. This anxiety wasn't picked up, concerns were picked up, and it had, unfortunately, some very serious and upsetting consequences in relation to the student. But as part of that decision, the High Court that looked at this made it very clear that institutions were under a proactive duty in relation to setting alternative assessments. You can't just sit back and wait for the student to approach you and tell you there's a particular problem. You're required to actually identify where there are issues with particular or individual students and to have an alternative assessment which is available for use. Now, in many cases, that alternative assessment has been a coursework. So it's been the go-to means of addressing reasonable adjustments in one form or another. And as Phil has identified, using coursework and other forms of written assessment is particularly vulnerable to use of generative AI, where that assessment is not supervised. And so there's been a lot of soul searching here in the university that if we can't use coursework as a form of alternative assessment, what do we do? Well, as Phil has alluded to, one of the things you can do is to start to develop that piece of written work or project-based work so that it actually becomes one of supervision in terms of how the actual outcome is achieved, i.e. you assess process. And one of the things you can do, and what we have done here at the institution, is to develop a requirement for a research record so that you know where students have gone, what they've looked at. But what's important here is that they have to evaluate not only the sources they've used, but the sources they have not used and why they have not used them, in an attempt to actually make the form of assessment more realistic and less susceptible to generative AI. So the go-to method of coursework as an alternative assessment really does need to be considered with a lot of care, it seems to me. And one of the ways you can do this is to combine it with a form of assessment which is in person or face-to-face, and look at the credit weighting that you allocate to individual assessments within the module. This can, of course, lead to more work. But just to pick on the point of oral assessment in relation to a large module, which I think has been raised in the chat. Here in the law school, one of my colleagues, who's responsible for 350 students on a core module, has moved 2 years ago from a written assessment to oral assessment as the primary means of assessing the student. Now, he did the due diligence around the time it would take to do this and came to the conclusion, which Phil suggested, that actually there's not much difference in terms of time and effort where you have oral assessment of that number of students and preparing, marking and moderating a written assessment. Now, the way they've done that here is to have basically advanced questions which the students can prepare for the oral assessment, and then hidden questions which they don't know about, which are then used to refine and actually give extra credit to the students in relation to that performance. So it's structured in a way in which students have some in advance of what they're going to be asked, but other questions they don't have knowledge about, and that's used to actually determine whether a student is of a 2-2, 2-1 or first standard. So again, staggered in terms of how the credit is awarded in relation to the assessment. But coming back to this issue of inclusivity and this anticipatory duty, that does mean, of course, not just working within the academic environment, but a close working relationship with professional services support within the institution and also students themselves. Because one of the obvious questions is to ask students, what is it you want? What is it you would determine to actually be a reasonable adjustment or determination in relation to this? Now, that, of course, means some form of structured interview around that. And one of the other things we're looking at here in the institution around extenuating circumstances, for example, is basically to scrap the system. We have found over the last 12 to 18 months, the number of applications for extenuating circumstances have risen significantly. And we are aware of other institutions, for example, who have moved to a system whereby students have, in effect, 2 or 3 attempts or 3 options to actually defer the assessment without evidence, to avoid basically the overload of professional services staff in trying to sift through the applications and evidence around an application for deferment. There is an issue with that, of course, is that a student could be deferring assessments to the point whereby there's high stakes assessment at the end of the academic year and may fail then to progress into the next academic stage of the programme, because basically they've created, in effect, basically a number of assessments at one point in time, which is causing a problem in terms of their ability to revise and pass. So again, something else we've had to consider here at the institution. So I think there's a number of issues around assessments that we've tried to address both through oral staggered assessments and also credit weighting in relation to different elements of assessments here to try and make things fair. But ultimately, of course, and I think Phil alluded to this as well, students will always be able to buy, if they have the money, the better form or product of generative AI that what we can offer basically offered to students as a platform here at the institution. Here at Swansea, everybody has access to Microsoft Copilot, whether it be staff or students. It works well, but some students will, of course, spend additional money to get additional help outside. And just as a nod to postgraduate students, because we have to consider this from an undergraduate, postgraduate taught and postgraduate research level as well, when we look at the use of generative AI, that we have found that postgraduate students, postgraduate taught students, continue to use essay nulls and contract cheating as a form of cheating as opposed to generative AI, partly because they don't understand the output that generative AI will actually give to them. I think I'll end next. It's 12:15. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you so much, Professor Draper.